The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long skeletal shadows across the street. Sarah sat on her porch, the quiet hum of the suburban night settling around her like a heavy blanket. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the silhouette of a figure standing motionless near the mailbox at the end of the driveway. She blinked, certain it had been a trick of the light, but when she looked again, the figure was still there. Her heart raced, but her body remained frozen, as though some unseen force held her in place. It was the way the figure stood, too still, too focused, as if it had been waiting for her. Days passed, and Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had wrapped itself around her. Her neighbors waved, smiling their polite smiles. But there was something off, something deeply unsettling about their faces. She couldn't pin it down at first. The smiles, perfectly shaped, seemed too symmetrical, their eyes too wide, almost vacant. She'd catch them watching her from across the street, from behind half-drawn blinds, always just out of direct view. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she'd hear faint footsteps on the sidewalk outside, deliberate and slow. But when she peered through the window, there was no one, just the empty street, eerily silent, as if the world was holding its breath. One night, after another round of sleepless hours spent jumping at shadows, she heard a soft knock at the door. She hesitated, standing in the hallway, the light from the kitchen casting a dim glow over the entrance. The knock came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was closer, almost too close. Slowly she opened the door, but the porch was empty. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed something small on the welcome mat. A single key. It wasn't hers. There was no note, no explanation, just that key, gleaming under the porch light like a promise or perhaps a warning. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She decided to leave, to escape whatever invisible force was gripping her life. But as she packed her bags, her cell phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, familiar, almost soothing. It was her neighbor, the one she'd seen standing by the mailbox that first night. His words seeped through the speaker, calm and precise. "You found the key, didn't you? It's time to come home." Her blood ran cold, and she tried to argue to hang up. But something in those words stirred deep inside her. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an undeniable truth. She looked around her house, her walls, her things, everything she thought was hers, but none of it felt right anymore. It hadn't for a long time. She realized too late that it wasn't the figure that was out of place. It was her. Always had been. The key, after all, had been hers all along. The first thing Clara noticed about the forest was how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet that came from peace, but the kind that pressed against her ears, heavy and unnatural. The trail beneath her boots was soft with damp leaves, their faint crunch the only sound as she walked further in. She had come here before, many times, but tonight something was different. The trees seemed taller, closer together, their branches twisting in a direction she couldn't quite place. She glanced back and realized she could no longer see the orange glow of her car's hazard lights through the trees. The forest had swallowed them whole, and with it her sense of direction. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped over a fallen log, its beam catching on something that made her stomach drop. A pile of rocks, unnaturally stacked, stood just off the trail. She didn't remember seeing it before. It wasn't just the shape of it, but the way the stones looked. They were smooth, polished, and so black they seemed to drink in the light. Something ancient and deliberate hung in the air around them. Clara told herself to keep moving, to ignore the unease prickling up her spine, But as she passed the stones, she swore she heard a sound, a low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the air. It wasn't a sound she heard with her ears, but felt deep in her chest, like a warning. The trail curved sharply, and her flashlight caught on another pile of the black stones, larger this time, with strange carvings etched into their surfaces. She stopped, staring at the crude symbols, her heart pounding in her ribcage. The markings looked almost human, but not quite. Hands with too many fingers, faces twisted in impossible expressions. She turned sharply, intending to head back, only to find the trail behind her completely gone. No fallen log, no path, just trees that stretched endlessly into the dark. Panic set in, tightening her throat as she fumbled for her phone, but the screen refused to light up. The hum grew louder, surrounding her, filling her head with static as if the forest itself was breathing in unison. Clara stumbled, her knees hitting the damp ground, and that's when she saw it. A figure stood just behind the nearest tree, barely visible but undeniably there. It wasn't moving, just watching, its outline shifting ever so slightly, as if it were part of the trees themselves. She couldn't make out its face, but the longer she stared, the more the forest seemed to blur around it, dissolving into an indistinct haze. Her breath hitched as the hum crescendoed, louder than her ragged gasps, louder than her pounding heart, and then, in a voice that wasn't quite a voice, it spoke, not to her ears but directly into her mind. "You are not lost. You are where you were always meant to be." As the words sank in, Clara realized the awful truth. The forest hadn't changed. She had. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the quiet, and the figure took one deliberate step forward. The city breathed differently at night, as if the darkness carried its own pulse. Ellie felt it, that faint hum just beneath the surface, vibrating through the soles of her boots as she walked the empty streets. The towering buildings loomed with a peculiar hostility, their windows blackened like 1,000 lifeless eyes. She told herself she was imagining things, that the cold edge crawling up her spine was simply the wind. Yet every step she took echoed louder than it should, as though the city itself was tracking her movements, biding its time. Her gaze darted to the streetlights. The glow seemed strained, flickering faintly like an exhausted star on the verge of burning out. She crossed an intersection and paused, noticing a figure in the distance standing completely still. It was too far away to make out details, but something about its rigid posture set her on edge. She willed herself forward, rationalizing that it was just someone out late like her, maybe waiting for a bus or deciding their next turn. But as she approached, the figure remained unnervingly stationary, their face obscured by the shadows. Ellie's chest tightened. The stillness was unnatural. It wasn't the hesitation of a lost tourist or the casual nonchalance of a lingerer. It was the posture of someone who didn't feel entirely human. She forced herself to keep moving, and as she passed the spot where the figure should have been, she realized there was nothing there. Her pace quickened instinctively, the city stretching out endlessly before her, the streets twisting and narrowing in ways they hadn't when she first set out. She tried to convince herself the layout wasn't shifting, that it was all in her head. But her surroundings seemed subtly wrong. At one point, she glanced up and saw the same coffee shop she had passed an hour ago, its chalkboard menu fluttering in the wind as if mocking her. She knew she hadn't turned back. She had walked straight, always forward. But here it was again, unmistakable. Above her, The streetlights flickered out one by one. The darkness gathered like a living thing, pressing in on her, and Ellie broke into a jog. Her footsteps sounded too sharp, too loud, too close. Were they still hers? She rounded a corner only to find herself at a dead end, an alley that hadn't existed the last time she came this way. Panic rose in her throat. The brick walls seemed to mold and shift, their surfaces glistening as though slick with rain, though the air was bone dry. She turned, ready to flee back the way she came, but froze. Something stood at the alley's entrance, no longer a vague figure but a tall, spindly thing that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its shape was barely discernible, contorting like smoke, but somehow solid. It tilted what might have been its head, as if studying her, its presence seeping into her mind like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. Ellie wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot. The city around them seemed to hold its breath as the darkness surged forward, and Ellie felt herself swallowed whole.